Hi there and happy Friday. I'm so glad to have you joining today on our daily Oz readings. I'm Mary, the librarian at the Claremont Branch Libraries, and we are starting a new Oz book today. We are starting the 15th book in the series, and it's the first by Ruth Plumley Thompson. It is The Royal Book of Oz, in which the Scarecrow goes to search for his family tree and discovers that he is the long-lost emperor of the Silver Islands, and how he was rescued and brought back to Oz by Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion. So if you're not familiar with the other Oz books, that's fine. You don't need to be familiar with them to enjoy this Oz book. If you are familiar with them, then you're going to have some of your favorite characters show up in this adventure, but you're also going to meet some new friends and characters, such as Sir Hoax of Pokes, the Doubtful Dromedary, and the Comfortable Camel. So it's a fun adventure. I hope you'll stick with me through the 2 weeks it'll take to finish the book. We'll read about 2 to 3 chapters a day and read every Monday through Friday. So let's go ahead and read our first chapters today and see what is in store for us as we read The Royal Book of Oz by Ruth Plumley Thompson. This is Chapter 1, Professor Wogglebug's Great Idea. The very thing! Exclaimed Professor Wogglebug, bounding into the air and upsetting his gold inkwell. The very next idea! Who, me? A round-faced little munchkin boy stuck his head in the door and regarded Professor Wogglebug solemnly. He was working his way through the professor's athletic college, and one of his duties was to wait upon this eminent educator of Oz. Certainly not, snapped Professor Wogglebug. You're a nobody or a nothing. Stop gaping and fetch me my hat. I'm off to the Emerald City, and mind the pupils take their history pills regularly while I'm gone, he added, clapping his tall hat Zif held out to him on the back of his head. Yes, sir, said the little munchkin respectfully. Don't hurry back, sir. This last remark the professor did not hear, for he was already halfway down the college steps. Ozma will be delighted with the idea. How clever I am, he murmured, twirling his antenna and walking rapidly down the pleasant blue lane. The professor, whose College of Art and Athletic Perfection is in the southwestern part of the Munchkin country, is the biggest bug in Oz, or in any place else for that matter. He has made education painless by substituting school pills for books. His students take Latin, history, and spelling pills. They swallow knowledge of every kind with ease and pleasure and spend the rest of their time in sport. No wonder he is so well thought of in Oz. No wonder he thinks so well of himself. Swinging his cane jauntily, the professor hurried toward the yellow brick road that leads to the Emerald City, and, by nightfall, had reached the lovely capital of Oz. Oz, that marvelous country where no one grows old, and where animals and birds talk as sensibly as people, and adventures happen every day. Indeed, of all the fairylands in the world, Oz is the most delightful, and of all fairy cities, the Emerald City is the most beautiful. The soft green light shone for miles about, and the gemmed turrets and spires of the palace flashed more brightly than the stars. But its loveliness was familiar to Professor Wogglebug, and, without a pause, he proceeded to Ozma's palace and was at once admitted to the great hall. A roar of merriment greeted his ears. Ozma, the lovely girl ruler of Oz, was having a party, and the room was full of most surprising people. Surprising to some, that is, but old friends to most of us. Jack, holding tightly to his pumpkin head, was running as fast as his wooden feet and wobbly legs would take him from Dorothy. A game of blind man's bluff was in full swing, and Scraps and Tick-Tock, the Scarecrow and Nick Chopper, the Glass Cat and the Cowardly Lion, the Wizard of Oz and the Wooden Sawhorse, Cap'n Bill and Betsy Bobbin, Billina and the Hungry Tiger, were tumbling over each other in an effort to keep away from the blindfolded little girl. But Dorothy was too quick for them. With a sudden whirl, she spun round and grasped a coat sleeve. "The Scarecrow!" she laughed triumphantly. "I can tell by the way he schwalks, and now he's it." "I'm always it," chuckled the droll person. "But ha! Behold the learned professor, standing so aloofly in our midst." No one had noticed Professor Wogglebug, who had been quietly watching the game. "I don't like to interrupt a party," he said, approaching Ozma's throne apologetically, "but I've had the most brilliant idea." "What? Another?" murmured the Scarecrow, rolling up his eyes. "Where did you lose it?" asked Jack Pumpkinhead, edging forward anxiously. "Lose it? Who said I'd lost it?" snapped the professor, glaring at poor Jack. "Well, you said you'd had it, and had is the past tense, so—" Jack's voice trailed off uncertainly, and Ozma, seeing he was embarrassed, begged the professor to explain. "Your Highness," began the professor, while the company settled down in a resigned circle on the floor, "as Oz is the most delightful country and interesting country on the continent of imagination, and its people the most unusual and talented, I am about to compile a royal book which will give the names and history of all our people. In other words, I am to be the great grand genealogist of Oz." "Whatever that is," the Scarecrow whispered in Dorothy's ear. "And," the professor frowned severely on the Scarecrow, "with your Majesty's permission, I shall start at once." "Please do," said the Scarecrow with a wave toward the door, "and we will go on with the party." Scraps, the patchwork girl, who had been staring fixedly at the professor with her silver suspender-button eyes, now sprang to her feet. "What is a genealogist? It's something no one here has missed. What puts such notions in your head? Turn out your toes or go to bed," she shouted gaily, then catching Ozma's disapproving glance, fell over backward. "I don't understand it at all," said Jack Pumpkinhead in a depressed voice. "I'm afraid my head's too ripe." "Nor I," said Tick-Tock, the clockwork man. "Please wind me up a little tighter, Dorothy. I want to think." Dorothy obligingly took a key suspended from a hook on his back and wound him up under his left arm. Everybody began to talk at once, and what with the Cowardly Lion's deep growl, and Tick-Tock's squeaky voice, and all the rest of the tin and meat and wooden voices, the confusion was terrible. "Wait!" cried Ozma, clapping her hands. Immediately, the room grew so still that one could hear Tick-Tock's machinery whirring. "Now," said Ozma, "one at a time, please. Let us hear from the Scarecrow first." The Scarecrow rose. "I think, Your Highness," he said modestly, "that anyone who has studied his geozophy already knows who we are, and—" "Who you are?" broke in the Wogglebug scornfully. "Of course they do, but I shall tell them who you were." "Who I were?" gasped the Scarecrow in a dazed voice, raising his cotton glove to his forehead. "Who I were? Well, who were I?" "That's just the point," said Professor Wogglebug. "Who were you? Who were your ancestors? Who is your family? Where is your family tree? From what did you descend?" At each question, the Scarecrow looked more embarrassed. He repeated the last one several times. "From where did I descend? From where did I descend? Why, from a beanpole!" he cried. This was perfectly true, for Dorothy, a little girl blown by a Kansas cyclone to the kingdom of Oz, had discovered the Scarecrow in a farmer's cornfield and had lifted him down from his pole. Together, they had made the journey to the Emerald City, where the Wizard of Oz had fitted him out with a fine set of brains. At one time, he had ruled Oz and was generally considered the cleverest citizen. Before he could reply further, the Patchwork Girl, who was simply irresistible, burst out. An extraordinary man he is, a beanpole for his family tree. The Cornish man, upon my soul, descended from a tall, thin pole. Nonsense, said Professor Wogglebug sharply. Being stuffed with straw may make him extraordinary, but it is quite plain that the Scarecrow was nobody before he was himself. He has no ancestors, no family, only a beanpole for a family tree, and is therefore entitled to the merest mention in the Royal Book of Oz. How about my brains? Asked the Scarecrow in a hurt voice. Aren't they enough? Brains have simply nothing to do with royalty. Professor Wogglebug waved his fountain pen firmly. Now. But see here, wasn't I a ruler of Oz? Put in the Scarecrow anxiously. A ruler, but never royalty, snapped out the professor. Now, if you will answer my questions as I call your names, I'll get the necessary data and be off. He took out a small memorandum book. Your Highness, he bowed to Ozma, need not bother. I have already entered your name at the head of the list. Being descended, as you are, from a long line of fairies, your family tree is the oldest and most illustrious in Oz. Princess Dorothy! At the sound of her name, the little girl stood up. I know you are from Kansas and were created a Princess of Oz by our gracious ruler. But can you tell me anything of your ancestors in America? Demanded the professor, staring over the top of his thick glasses. You'll have to ask Uncle Henry and Aunt Em, said Dorothy rather sulkily. The professor had hurt the feelings of her best friend, the Scarecrow, and ancestors did not interest her one little bit. Very well, said the professor, writing industriously in his book. I'll just enter you as Dorothy, Princess of Oz, and sixth cousin to a president. I'm not! Dorothy shook her head positively. Oh, everyone in America can claim that, said the professor easily. Nick Chopper! Now up rose our old friend, the Tin Woodman, who had also been discovered by Dorothy on her first trip to the fairyland of Oz. You were a man of meat at one time, and a woodman by trade, queried the Professor Wogglebug, poising his pen in the air. I am a Tin Woodman, and you may enter me in your book under the name of Smith, for a tinsmith made me, and, as a royal emperor of the Winkies, I do not care to go back to my meat connections. And the Tin Woodman said in a dignified voice. The company applauded, and the Cowardly Lion thumped the floor with his tail. Smith is a very good name. I can work up a whole chapter on that, smiled the professor. The Tin Woodman had once been a regular person, but a wicked witch enchanted his axe, and first he chopped off one leg, then the other, next both arms, and his head. After each accident, Nick went to a tinsmith for repairs, and finally was entirely made of tin. Nowhere but in Oz could such a thing happen, but no one can be killed in this marvelous country, and Nick, with his tin body, went gaily on living, and was considered so distinguished that the Winkies had begged him to be their emperor. Scraps, called the professor, as Nick sat stiffly down beside Dorothy. Patchwork Girl pirouetted madly to the front. Putting one finger in her mouth, she sung, I'm made of patches, as you see, a clothes tree is my family tree, but pshaw, it's all the same to me. A clothes tree? Even Professor Wogglebug grinned. Who could help laughing at Scraps? Made of odd pieces of goods, and brought to life by the powder of life, the comical girl was the jolliest person imaginable. Put me down as a man of metal, drawled Tick-Tock, the copper man, as the laughing followed Scrap's rhyme had subsided. Tick-Tock was still another of Dorothy's discoveries, and this marvelous machine man, guaranteed to last 1,000 years, could think, walk, and talk when properly wound. The Cowardly Lion was entered as king in his own right. One after the other, the celebrities of Oz came forward to answer Professor Wogglebug's questions. The professor wrote rapidly in his little book. Ozma listened attentively to each one. They all seemed interested, except the Scarecrow. Slumped down beside Dorothy, he stared morosely at the ceiling, his jolly face all wrinkled down to one side. "If only I knew who I were," he muttered over and over. I must think." "Don't you mind," Dorothy patted his shoulder kindly. "Royalties are out of date, and I'll bet the professor's family tree was milkweed." But the Scarecrow refused to be comforted, and long after the company had retired, he sat hunched sadly in his corner. "I'll do it! I'll do it!" he exclaimed at last, rising unsteadily onto his feet. Jellia Jam, Ozma's little waiting maid, returned somewhat later to fetch a handkerchief her mistress had dropped, was surprised to see him running through the long hall. "Why, where are you going?" asked Jellia. "To find my family tree," said the Scarecrow darkly, and drawing himself up his full height, he fell through the doorway. Chapter 2. The Scarecrow's Family Tree. The moon shone brightly, but everyone in the Emerald City was fast asleep. Through the deserted streets hurried the Scarecrow. For the first time since his discovery by little Dorothy, he was really unhappy. Living as he did in a fairyland, he had taken many things for granted, and had rather prided himself on his unusual appearance. Indeed, not until Professor Wogglebug's rude remarks concerning his family had he given his past a thought. "I'm the only person in Oz without a family," he reflected sorrowfully. "Even the Cowardly Lion has kingly parents and a palm tree. But I must keep thinking. My brains have never failed me yet. Who was I? Who were I? Who were I?" Often he thought so hard that he forgot to look where he was going, and ran headlong into fences, stumbled down gutters, over stiles. But fortunately, the dear fellow could not get hurt, and he would struggle up, pat his straw into shape, and walk straightway into something else. He made good time in between falls. The yellow brick road. He made good time between falls, however, and was soon well on his way down the yellow brick road that ran through the Munchkin country. For he had determined to return to the Munchkin farm where Dorothy had first discovered him, and try to find some traces of his family. Now, being stuffed with straw has many advantages, for requiring neither food nor sleep, the Scarecrow could travel night and day without interruption. The stars winked out one by one, and by the time the cocks of the Munchkin farmers began to crow, he had come to the banks of a broad blue river. The Scarecrow took off his hat, scratched his head thoughtfully. Crossing rivers is no easy matter in Oz, for there isn't a fairy in the kingdom, and unless one is a good swimmer, or equipped with some of the wizard's magic, it is mighty troublesome. Water does not agree with the Scarecrow at all, and as for swimming, he can no more swim than a bag of meal. But he was too wise a person to give up merely because a thing appeared to be impossible. It was for just such emergencies that his excellent brains had been given him. "If Nick Chopper were here, he would build a raft in no time," murmured the Scarecrow. "But as he is not, I must think of another way." Turning his back upon the river, which distracted his mind, he began to think with all his might. Before he could collect his thoughts, there was a tremendous crash, and the next minute he was lying face down in the mud. Several little crashes followed, and a shower of water. Then a wet voice called out with a cheerful chuckle, "Come on out, my dear Rattles. Not a bad place at all, and here's breakfast already waiting. Breakfast? The Scarecrow turned over cautiously. A huge and curious creature was slashing through the grass toward him. A smaller and still more curious one followed. Both were extremely damp and had evidently just come out of the water. "Good morning," quavered the Scarecrow, sitting up with a jerk, and at the same time reaching for a stick that lay just behind him. "I won't eat it if it talks, so there." The smaller creature stopped and stared fixedly at the Scarecrow. The Scarecrow, hearing this, tried to think of something else to say, but the appearance of the two was so amazing that, as he told Dorothy afterwards, he was struck dumb. The larger was at least 200 feet long and made entirely of blocks of wood. On each block was a letter of the alphabet. The head was a huge square block with a serpent's face and long curling tape measure tongue. The little one was very much smaller and seemed to consist of hundreds of rattles, wood, celluloid, and rubber, fastened together with wires. Every time it moved, the rattles tinkled. Its face, however, was not unpleasant, so the Scarecrow took heart and made a deep bow. "And I'm not going to eat anything that squirms." This time it was the big serpent who spoke. "Thank you," said the Scarecrow, bowing several more times. "You relieve my mind. I've never been a breakfast yet, and I'd rather not begin. But if I cannot be your breakfast, let me be your friend." He extended his arms impulsively. There was something so jolly about the Scarecrow's smile that the two creatures became friendly at once, and moreover, told the story of their lives. "As you have doubtless noted," began the larger creature, "I am an ABC serpent. I am employed in the nursery of the mer children to teach them their letters. My friend here is a rattlesnake, and it is his business to amuse the mer babies while the mermaids are mer marketing. Once a year we take a vacation, and proceeding from the sea depths up a strange river, we came out on this shore. Perhaps you, sir, will be able to tell us where we are." "You are in the Munchkin country of the Land of Oz," exclaimed the Scarecrow politely. "It is a charming place for a vacation. I would show you about it myself if I were not bound on an important mission." Here the Scarecrow sighed deeply. "Have you a family?" he asked the ABC serpent curiously. "Yes, indeed," replied the monster, snapping its tape measure tongue in and out. "I have 5 great-grandmothers, 21 grandnieces, 7 brothers, and 6 sisters-in-law." "Ah," murmured the Scarecrow, clasping his hands tragically, "how I envy you! I have no one, no aunts, no ancestors, no family tree but a beanpole. I am, alas, a man without a past." The Scarecrow looked so dejected that the rattlesnake thought he was going to cry. "Oh, cheer up," it begged in a distressed voice. "Think of your presence. Here, I give you permission to shake me." The Scarecrow was so affected by this kind offer that he cheered up immediately. "No past, but a presence. I'll remember that." He swelled out, drawn his straw chest complacently, and leaning over, stroked the rattlesnake on the head. "Are you good at riddles?" asked the rattlesnake timidly. "Well," answered the Scarecrow judiciously, "I have very good brains, given me by the famous Wizard of Oz." "Then why is the ABC serpent like a city?" asked the rattlesnake promptly. The Scarecrow thought hard for several seconds. "Because it's made up of blocks!" he roared triumphantly. "That's easy. Now it's my turn. Why is the ABC serpent such a slow talker?" "Give it up," said the rattlesnake, shaking himself several times. "Because his tongue is a tape measure, and he has to measure his words," cried the Scarecrow, snapping his clumsy fingers. And that's a good one, if I did make it myself. I must remember to tell it to Dorothy." Then he sobered, said quite suddenly, for the thought of Dorothy brought back the purpose of his journey. Interrupting the rattlesnake in the midst of a new riddle, he explained how anxious he was to return to the little farm where he had been discovered and try to find some traces of his family. "And the real riddle," he sighed, with a wave toward the rushing stream, "is how to cross this river." "That's easy, and no riddle at all," rumbled the sea serpent, who had been listening attentively to the Scarecrow's remarks. "I'll stretch across, and you can walk over." Suiting the action to the word, he began backing very cautiously toward the river so as not to shake the Scarecrow off its feet. "Mind your P's and Q's," called the rattlesnake warningly. It was well that he spoke, for the ABC serpent had doubled the P and Q blocks under, and they were ready to snap off. Finally, however, he managed to make a bridge of himself, and the Scarecrow stepped easily over the blocks, the huge serpent holding himself rigid. Just as he reached the Y, the unfortunate creature sneezed and all the blocks rattled together. Up flew the Scarecrow and escaped falling into the stream only by the narrowest margin. "Blockhead!" shrilled the rattlesnake, who had taken a great fancy to the Scarecrow. "I'm all right," cried the Scarecrow, rather breathlessly. "Thank you very much." He sprang nimbly up the bank. "Hope you have a pleasant vacation." "Can't, with a rattled pate like that." The ABC serpent nodded glumly in the rattlesnake's direction. "Now don't quarrel," begged the Scarecrow. "You are both charming and unusual, and if you follow that yellow brick road, you will come to the Emerald City, and Ozma will be delighted to welcome you." "The Emerald City! We must see that, my dear Rattles." Forgetting his momentary displeasure, the ABC serpent pulled himself up out of the river, and waving his XYZ blocks in farewell to the Scarecrow, went clattering down the road, the little rattlesnake rattling along behind him. As for the Scarecrow, he continued his journey, and the day was so delightful and the country so pleasant that he almost forgot he had no family. He was treated everywhere with the greatest courtesy and had innumerable invitations from the hospitable Munchkins. He was very anxious to reach his destination, however, so refused them all, and traveling night and day, came without further mishap or adventure late on the second evening to the little Munchkin farm where Dorothy had first discovered him. He was curious to know whether the pole on which he had been hoisted to scare away the crows still stood in the cornfield, and whether the farmer who had made him could tell him anything further about his history. "It is a shame to waken him," thought this kind Scarecrow. "I'll just take a look in the cornfield." The moon shone so brightly that he had no trouble finding his way about. With a little cry of pleasure, he pushed his way through the dry corn stalks. There, in the center of the field, stood a tall pole, the very identical bean pole from which he had descended. "All the family tree I've got," cried the Scarecrow, running toward it with emotion. "What's that?" A window in the farmhouse was thrown up, and a sleepy Munchkin thrust out his head. "What are you doing?" he called crossly. "Thinking," said the Scarecrow, leaning heavily against the bean-pole. "Well, don't do it out loud," snapped the farmer. Then, catching a better view of the Scarecrow, he cried in surprise, "Why, you! Come right in, my dear fellow, and give us the latest news from the Emerald City. I'll fetch a candle." The farmer was very proud of the Scarecrow. He had made him long ago, by stuffing one of his old suits of straw, painting a jolly face on a sack, stuffing that, and fastening the two together. Red boots, a hat, and yellow gloves had finished his man, and nothing could have been jollier than the result. Later on, when the Scarecrow had run off with Dorothy and got his brains from the Wizard of Oz and become ruler of the Emerald City, the little farmer had felt highly gratified. The Scarecrow, however, was not in a humor for conversation. He wanted to think in peace. "Don't bother," he called up. "I'm going to spend the night right here. I'll see you in the morning." "All right, take care of yourself," yawned the farmer, and drew in his head. For a long time the Scarecrow stood perfectly still beside the beanpole, thinking. Then he got a spade from the shed and began clearing away the cornstalks and dried leaves from around the base of the pole. It was slow work, for his fingers were very clumsy, but he persevered. Then a wonderful idea came to him. "Perhaps, if I dig down a bit, I may discover—" He got no further, for at the word discover, he pushed the spade down with all his might. There was a loud crash. The bottom dropped out of things, and the Scarecrow fell through. "Great cornstalks!" cried the Scarecrow, throwing up his arms. To his surprise, they came in contact with a stout pole, for he was shooting down into the darkness at a great rate. "Why," he gasped as soon as he regained his breath, for he was falling at a terrific rate of speed. "Why, I believe I'm sliding down the beanpole." That's the end of our chapter and the end of our reading for today. I hope you enjoyed the first few chapters of our book, and we'll come back on Monday to find out where the Scarecrow is as he's sliding down the beanpole and what will happen to him as he reaches wherever he's going underground. So come back on Monday, find out what is going to happen in our book. Until then, I hope that you have a wonderful weekend.